The Federation and the legal systems in the Federation. Topics covered in this PowerPoint. United Federation of States. Jobs of the governments. Court systems, Fed and state. No, we do not study the entity called the United Federation of Planets, but we do study a similar entity called the United States. How the United Federation of States governments operate. I wish the name of the federation called the United States was more accurately named the United Federation of States, but it is not.
Grammar note. The state's government is. The state's governments are.
Governments. The United Federation of States is made up of more than 300 governments. This may or may not be the first time you have been told that the US is a federation of over 300 semi-independent governments. Each government in the federation has its own laws and court systems. These governments in the federation can be divided into the following categories. Federal or US government 1. State governments 50. Tribal governments over 250. Others, DC, protectorates, territories, etc.
Answer this before moving on. True/false. The United States is a federation of different governments. Google and write answers on note sheet to these. What is a federation? Google United States of America and go to the Wikipedia site. List at least 4 entities in the United States of America as stated there in the first sentences.
Jobs of the governments in the Federation. The governments in the Federation called the United States can be divided into the following categories, and each was created via a constitution or similarly named document. Federal government 1. State governments 50. Tribal governments over 250. Others, DC, protectorates, territories, etc.
Answer this question before moving on. True/false. The United States has more than 300 constitutions.
A constitution creates a government such as executive, agencies, legislature, Senate, House, agencies, judicial aka courts. Each government in the Federation has its own set of laws. Federal aka United States constitutional law. Federal statutes. Federal regulations. Federal case law. Each government in the Federation has its own set of laws. State constitutional law, for example Michigan constitutional law. State statutes, for example Michigan state statutes. State regulations, for example Michigan state regulations. State case law, for example Michigan case law. Each government in the Federation has its own set of laws. Tribal constitutional/organizing law. Tribal statutes. Tribal regulations. Tribal case law. Powers of the federal government. The U.S. Constitution and the cases that interpret the U.S. Constitution, collectively called U.S. constitutional law, tell us the following. How the U.S. aka federal government is organized. What the federal government can and cannot do. Powers of the federal government. However, the power of the federal government increased dramatically after the Civil War. Powers of the federal government. Since shortly after the U.S. Civil War, the U.S. Constitution also sets minimum standards for state governments regarding civil rights. 13, 14, 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution allowing the federal government to set certain minimum standards for state governments. Example: states cannot allow slavery. State must respect free speech and other rights listed in the Bill of Rights. Powers of the federal government, simplified. Back to the jobs of the governments in the Federation. Federal government can do the following types of things. Regulate interstate commerce. Most U.S. aka federal government activity is based on this power. Protect basic rights of the populace from all of the governments in the Federation. Free speech, freedom of religion, etc. International relations. Military. Issue patents. Print money. State/tribal/territorial governments have what is called police power to control every action of people and businesses in the state, unless it conflicts with the minimum standards set by U.S. constitutional law, contract law, property law, tort law, family law, etc. Everything else. Note: the exact powers of tribal governments versus states are different and not a concept covered in this class. However, this simplified explanation is sufficient for this class.
Answer this question before moving on. True/false. The term police power is talking about the power of the local police force.
Powers of the state, tribal, territorial, but not federal government. True or false? A state/tribal/territorial government can pass any law it wants as long as it does not conflict with the rights given to the people in the U.S. Constitution and the particular state/tribal/territorial's constitution. Answer: true. Google, if necessary, list one of the rights guaranteed to the population by the Bill of Rights or the 13th or the 14th Amendments and write it down on a piece of notepaper. Court systems. Each government in the Federation has its own court system. Each government's court system is primarily designed to handle the laws of that government, but some overlap exists in the Federation. Court systems in the Federation. Federal courts. Court systems in the Federation. Federal courts. United States Supreme Court hears cases involving federal law. United States Appeal Courts hear cases involving federal law. United States Trial Courts hear cases involving federal law. Note: some rare exceptions exist and we will not study. State courts. State Supreme Court hears cases involving state law, federal law, the law of any other country. State appeal courts do the same. State trial courts do the same. Federal court power aka jurisdiction. Cases involving all federal laws. Cases involving state laws that violate the minimum standards established by the U.S. Constitution on states. Federal law. U.S. constitutional law. Federal statutes. Federal regulations. Federal case law. State courts power aka jurisdiction. Cases involving that state's laws. Cases involving federal law, some exceptions, we will not study. Cases involving law of any country. Federal court power aka jurisdiction questions. Arthur claims his First Amendment rights to freedom of religion as defined in U.S. constitutional law have been violated by a law passed by the Congress of the United States, legislative body of the U.S. government. Can this case be filed in a federal court? Answer: yes. Can this case be appealed up to the U.S. Supreme Court? Answer: yes.
Questions. Chloe claims that Law X passed by the state of Michigan violates her First Amendment rights to freedom of speech as defined in U.S. constitutional law, have been violated. Specific details about Law X are irrelevant to the question. Can this case be filed in a federal court? Answer, yes. Can this case be filed in a state court? Answer, yes. Does the plaintiff have an option of filing in the federal or state court? Answer, yes. If the plaintiff filed in a state court, could this case be appealed up to the U.S. Supreme Court? Answer, yes. Why? Answer, state courts can hear matters involving federal law. Some exceptions we will not study. True/false, in this example we have two laws fighting to determine which controls, Law X passed by the state of Michigan vs. U.S. constitutional law. Answer, yes. Supreme Courts. Many students have been taught the U.S. Supreme Court is the Supreme Court of the land. This is a simplification that is so simplified it is totally wrong. The U.S. Supreme Court is only the Supreme Court for federal laws, not state laws. The Michigan State Supreme Court, not the U.S. Supreme Court, has the final say on Michigan state law unless that Michigan law violates the minimum standards set by the U.S. Constitution on the member states in the Federation. In that situation we have a U.S. constitutional aka U.S. law issue that can be ultimately decided by the U.S. Supreme Court because we have a battle between a Michigan law and the U.S. Constitution. Questions. And claims that Ben violated Law XYZ passed by the state of Michigan and Ben owes and damages. Specific details about Law XYZ are irrelevant to the question. Can this case be appealed up to the Michigan Supreme Court? Answer, yes. Can this case be appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court? Answer, no. Why does the U.S. Supreme Court have no power, jurisdiction, to hear this case? Answer, it is a matter of state law only, U.S. constitutional law is not involved. How do I know when a case involves a constitutional law issue? Easy peasy. Basically, all constitutional law cases, whether state constitution or federal constitution are involved, have the same question or issue. Did the government, or some part of the government, or some person working for the government, have the power to do what they did? If the case involves just people or businesses with some dispute between themselves, you know the case is not a constitutional law case. Question, which is a constitutional law issue? Issue in the case is a law passed by the legislature valid? Issue in case is, did B breach its contract? Issue in case is, was C negligent? Answer, 1. How do you know? It is the only question that asks if a government, or part of a government, specifically the legislature, had power to do what it did. Review questions. If you cannot answer these, go back and review. True or false, a constitution, such as the United States Constitution, just controls how a government operates, it does not control people or businesses. True or false, I can always tell if a problem/case/matter/issue/question/news story/conversation is discussing a constitutional law issue because it will be asking if the government had the power to do whatever is the topic of the problem/case/matter/issue/question/news story/conversation. True or false, constitutions often list things governments can and cannot do. The end. Study guide aka major concepts listed on next slides. Topics in this presentation. United, Federation, of States. Jobs of the governments. Court systems, Fed and State. Governments in the United Federation of States. The United Federation of States is made up of more than 300 governments. First, many students are not really aware that the US is a federation of over 300 governments that for the most part are totally separate but do some things together under the entity called the federal or US government. These governments in the federation can be divided into the following categories. Federal government, 1. State governments, 50. Tribal governments, over 250. Others, D.C., protectorates, territories, etc. Powers of the federal government. The U.S. Constitution and the cases that interpret the U.S. Constitution, collectively called U.S. constitutional law, tell us what the U.S. aka federal government can and cannot do. List below is pretty much it. Regulate interstate commerce. Most U.S. aka federal government activity is based on this power. Protect basic rights of the populace from all of the governments in the Federation. Free speech, freedom of religion, etc. International relations. Military. Issue patents. Powers of the federal government. The U.S. Constitution and constitutional law cases, collectively referred to as U.S. constitutional law, set minimum standards for all of the governments in the Federation. Some actions state/tribal/territorial governments cannot do because U.S. constitutional law says they cannot. Legalize slavery. Force everyone to have the same religion. Require newspapers to get government approval of news stories. This is a tiny list and there are many other limits placed on governments in the Federation. Powers of the federal government. To find out what limits are placed on governments in the Federation, study U.S. constitutional law. Note, state/tribal/territorial constitutions can place additional limits on the state/tribal/territorial government. The U.S. constitutional limits are only the minimum. Federal court system. Cases involving any federal law can appealed up to the U.S. Supreme Court. If the case only involves state law, only the state Supreme Court can hear it. The matter cannot be heard by the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court is the Supreme Court of the land only for federal law, not state law. Powers of the state, tribal, territorial, but not federal government. Not a complete list but includes police power, that is power to control all acts of people and business in the state/reservation/territory. Google police power of the state. Notice that the federal government does not have police power. State government police power is limited by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution and some other U.S. constitutional provisions. Property law. Contract law. Criminal law. Some few federal crimes do exist if they involve interstate commerce. Family law. Education.
Each government in the Federation has its own set of laws. Federal aka United States constitutional law. Federal statutes. Federal regulations. Federal case law. Each government in the Federation has its own set of laws. State constitutional law, for example Michigan constitutional law. State statutes, for example Michigan state statutes. State regulations, for example Michigan state regulations. State case law, for example Michigan case law. Each government in the Federation has its own set of laws. Tribal constitutional/organizing law. Tribal statutes. Tribal regulations. Tribal case law.
How do I know if the case involves a constitutional law issue? Basically, all constitutional law cases have the same question or issue. Did the government, or some part of the government, or some person working for the government, have the power to do what they did? If the case involves just people or businesses with some dispute between themselves, you know the case is not a constitutional law case.